Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, I'd like to welcome you to this discussion today with war correspondent and author Toby Harnden, who will be engaging with us in a very interesting conversation moderated by our very own Joshua Huminski, talking about Toby's book, First Casualty, the Untold Story of the CIA Mission to Avenge 9/11. Mr. Harnden joins us after having spent quite a bit of time in the field in a large number of countries, including Afghanistan, and has reflected on the early days of the US intervention. I should say the coalition intervention, with a focus on CIA and the American experience. Of course, this is a very interesting time to go back and look at this moment in history. We are endeavoring to gather the lessons learned from the 20 years of conflict in Afghanistan, from the early days when there was a large both domestic and global alignment of cause to enter Afghanistan post 9/11 and to vanquish the Taliban and their al-Qa'ida allies through over a 20-year span, now trying to understand the most important lessons learned for US and partner forces, ranging from military to intelligence and everything in between, including civilian organizations that were working on nation building. We're very happy to have Toby with us to have this conversation. The work of intelligence professionals, as we have focused on over the last year and a half in our Great Powers competition program, is vital to outcomes. But there is a lot of nuance in how these things are carried out, and they are very specific to the environments in which they operate and the politics that surround them. So it's a great opportunity to have this conversation. Toby, thank you for being with us this morning, or this afternoon. And with that, let me turn it over to Joshua Huminski to open up the conversation with Toby. We will be accepting questions submitted through the question function. If a question comes to mind, please go ahead and send it over, and Joshua will fold it into the conversation. Joshua, take it away.
Thank you, Glenn. Toby, it's very exciting for me to actually be speaking with you because I'm a very big fan of your writing and reporting. I think I mentioned in our exchanges, my first encounter with your work was Dead Men Risen, which was recommended to me by a guards officer who was a colleague of mine. And I do want to talk about that book as well, and sort of the broader question of Afghanistan. But I really want to just focus in first on Team Alpha's story and the opening salvo of the war in Afghanistan, which I think you masterfully capture not just what was going on the ground, but that sense of uncertainty, that sense of confusion, but also the sense of clarity and mission at the beginning, which is very far removed from where we were in August of this year. So I want to take it back to the beginning, and what made you decide to write this book? What drew you to Team Alpha's story, and how did that process all start?
Yeah, well, thanks, Joshua, and thank you, Glenn. And I'm very pleased to be here. And I've watched your previous broadcast podcasts with great interest. So thank you. So, I mean, the book starts on 9/11 with three members of Team Alpha: David Tyson, who was in the air flying from Tashkent in Uzbekistan to London to talk about Stinger missiles that the CIA had provided to the Mujahideen in the 1980s, and were the agency was seeking to recover. Justin Sapp, who was a Green Beret captain doing the Special Forces diver qualification course, who was underwater on 9/11, and Mike Spann, the eponymous first casualty, former Marine Corps officer, CIA paramilitary, who was in CIA headquarters, and actually his wife, Shannon Spann, who was also a CIA officer, but was on parental leave and was in a giant supermarket in Manassas Park in Virginia. And so that's where the book starts, and it's very much a sort of 9/11 book. and I wanted to sort of capture that moment. And as you say in your question, Joshua, the sense of sort of unity and clarity and sort of simplicity, or almost, of that time. And that's why I wrote it. I mean, I was in Washington, D.C. on 9/11. I was walking into the Telegraph newspaper bureau that morning, just as the first plane hit the World Trade Center. And like everybody else, I thought it was, the reporting was that it was a Cessna, some kind of small aircraft. And then I was, sitting down watching CNN live, and I saw the second plane, which was clearly a passenger jet, go into the Trade Center, the second aircraft, and that had a massive impact on me, as it did with every American. I wasn't an American at that stage. I became an American in 2009. I'm a dual citizen. I think it was one of the reasons why I became an American eventually. And that night I went home. I knew Barbara Olson, who was one of the first victims named, the wife of Ted Olson, then Solicitor General. So somebody I knew had been killed that day. There were Humvees on the street corners, the National Guard in uniform, and there was this sort of sense of, is the next attack going to be tomorrow or next week or next month? But it's a matter of when, not if. And so that's extraordinary to think of, given that we haven't suffered a major attack on the homeland in the 20 years since. And so I was covering, I went up to the Flight 93 site, I think probably 2 days afterwards in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And, the country was at war. And, and I vividly remember the news of Mike Spann being killed during the prison uprising in Kalajangi, November 25th, 2001. His funeral with Shannon Spann speaking, so eloquently and movingly at Arlington Cemetery. And I remember, the reporting on the so-called American Taliban, who was actually al-Qa'ida, turned out to be al-Qa'ida, John Walker Lind. And it was incredible, but everything moved on very, very quickly. And we were soon into Iraq war planning in early 2002, this kind of swift victory that had been achieved. But it was a couple of years later, I was in Iraq, strangely enough, and somebody said, did you ever see the footage of that CIA officer who was with Mike Spann, running for his life with a pistol in one hand and a rifle in the other? And I hadn't seen it. And even though I'd written a couple of sort of basic sort of news stories about Mike Spann's death, and I did look at the footage on YouTube at the Hamra Hotel in Baghdad, and I saw this guy who was clearly had been through something incredibly traumatic, running for his life. He didn't know whether he was going to live for another 5 minutes, another 5 hours, or what. He was he'd just seen his comrade being killed. He was in a very, very sort of dangerous situation. And I saw these sort of staring eyes, these sort of, the sort of 1,000-yard stare, sometimes called. He'd been through something extremely traumatic. And I was just fascinated by him. And so that was David Tyson, a case officer, former academic, Uzbek linguist, amongst many other languages. And so that sort of never left me. And, sort of fast forward to, it was about 2012, 2013, I decided to try and find him. And I eventually tracked him down through an academic, actually, at Indiana University, who sort of put me in touch. And I remember my phone rang. I was covering Chris Christie, running for re-election in 2013 in New Jersey. Wasn't particularly enjoying covering that, the experience of Christie on the trail that year. And the phone rang, and it was David Tyson. And so I met him in a Panera Bread in Vienna, Virginia, in the Washington, D.C. suburbs, pretty close to where I am now. And he couldn't say very much because he was still serving in the CIA, but he talked to me a little bit. And I sort of kept in touch with him. He sort of dropped off. He was doing a lot of work on Russia issues. Clearly, having a sort of relationship with the journalist would be complicated. So, years would go by and I wouldn't hear from him. And then he called me up at the beginning of 2020, actually just after I'd got the book deal, and said, I've just retired. I'm ready to talk. And so that's how it came about. But I didn't know the other members of Team Alpha at that point. And so, I sort of painstakingly went from one person to the next and pieced it all together.
That's one thing that I think I do want to explore that I found particularly fascinating in the book was just how candid you were able to get these intelligence officers to be with you. On the one hand, speaking about, which was a very tragic event, but also part of a broader success for the agency, which is not very well reflected on today.
Yeah.
There's a film, Horse Soldiers, about the ODAs. I think it's Thor, whatever his Hemsworth is, the lead actor in that one.
Chris Hemsworth.
But there's no equivalent for the agency, and so I'm curious how you were able to get these individuals that operate and live behind the shadows, that don't do things publicly, to be so candid and honest with you. And because I thought that was one component of the book that was incredibly refreshing, because this was not just an action story. You speak very warm and affectionately of Michael Spann's widow and Shannon Spann, what she had been through, and just the emotions that these individuals felt and experienced and everything that they went through. So I'm curious how you established that relationship and how you got them to be candid.
Well, I certainly wanted to capture this on a sort of emotional and a psychological level, and certainly what David Tyson went through, and Shannon Spann as well. I mean, there are deep sort of psychological sort of wounds and complications, and to me, that's what sort of made the story so fascinating. I mean, there've been so many books and accounts of sort of, as you say, sort of action and sort of the Black Hawk Down, 12 Strong, the movie, where it's gun-toting Americans, killing the bad guys, and certainly there's an element to the narrative in that book, but I really did want to go deeper, and I think give an extra sort of dimension to the story. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I approached David and said what I end up saying to the others, which is, I've got a bit of experience here. I've written a couple of books before. So I wrote a book about the IRA in 1999, and then Dead Men Risen was in 2011. So, those were in a way are calling cards. Like, this is what I do. These are not polemics. These are, built on, detail, but also involving sort of context and what it means. So how the sort of the granular detail fits into the sort of strategic context. I said, I have no agenda. I just want to know what happened. I mean, it's in a way it's a simple aim, but to write what happened is really very difficult, because often the individuals themselves, they have only one sort of viewpoint, and they get tunnel vision, and so the things they know sort of they feel and think about and reflect on sort of disproportionately, and so it's very sort of complex putting it together. But I listened, and I gave them time. I mean, one of the great things now, there's AI transcription. So, I can do a 5-hour interview, and the interviews, I mean, I think I interviewed David Tyson. I stayed there, had dinner, stayed the night, we probably talked for 12 hours at one point, and you can feed the audio file into this AI transcription, and it'll come out and it'll be sort of 85% there, which is just sort of incredible. You can then search for words. And so, I believed in letting them talk, and sometimes they would go off on, big tangents, but often the tangents sort of lead somewhere sort of unexpected. And so I just sort of soaked up as much about the events, their feelings, the thought processes they went through as I could. And, I reached a point, I think, which it's a great moment for an author, where you can start to tell the participants what happened, things that they didn't know, or you can help fit things together. And it's almost like a sort of a tipping point. And then what that also means is that you're giving as well as taking. So you're helping to make sense of the story for them. And so, for instance, David just said to me the other day, he said that he'd never really appreciated the roles of J.R. Seeger, who was the Near East Division case officer, who was the chief, former 82nd Airborne officer. He'd worked with the Mujahideen in the 1980s. And his deputy, Alex Hernandez, who was a special forces sergeant major, retired, storied military career, who then became a CIA paramilitary. And he was so the chief and the deputy. And David, who was something of an outlier on the team in a way because he had the least sort of military experience. He said to me, I never really gave them the sort of the credit they deserved, or sort of understood how much they achieved and how much they had on their plate until you put it together. And so that's a wonderful moment, because it's not just take, it's give, and it becomes a sort of a dialogue. And at that point, you sort of know that you're getting to something. It's not like you're just getting some people to tell you something. It's like you're sort of almost creating something that is there, but sort of under the surface. And so I don't know, I mean, all my experience, I was in the Navy myself in Britain, I joined in 85, left in 94. I'd been embedded a lot in Iraq and Afghanistan, spent a lot of time in some sort of bad places, and been in some sort of, tight spots myself. And so I think all that kind of experience of life and everything you sort of bring to the table in sort of, establishing a rapport with people, and, and getting them to trust you and sort of, relate to you as a person, rather than just sort of an author or a journalist,
Speaking about the book specifically, because obviously the book had been agreed to and written prior to the events of August and the frankly disastrous withdrawal. And I'm curious if what happened in August brought new poignancy or power to the book for you in terms of writing it, in terms of its release. Obviously, it was going to be the 20th anniversary, regardless of what happened in terms of the withdrawal. And I'm just curious, how have those events either affected sort of the reception of the book or your thoughts and feelings on the book?
So, yeah, I mean, that's all very sort of complicated. I mean, a year ago, I was in Afghanistan, and I was I interviewed Abdul Rashid Dostum. I interviewed two doctors, medics who had seen the last moments of Mike Spann. I went to Kalajangi and sort of, walked the ramparts, if you like, and took it all in. I mean, one of the takeaways, I was there for 6 weeks, and one of the takeaways from my time was, we're done. The Taliban's going to take control. I mean, I interviewed Dostum in Sheberghan, which was his sort of adopted hometown, his stronghold. And it took me more than a week to get out because the roads were unsafe. I had to wait for an Mi-17 helicopter. They were busy, ferrying troops back and forth and bodies. At one point, I was due to get onto a helicopter and they're like, no, there's a dead soldier on board. I was like, I don't mind, but no, we got to go to his village. It was astonishing to me, and I didn't see a single American or NATO troop in those 6 weeks. The sort of wealthier Afghans, some of the sort of Dostum circle, their families were out. They were in Uzbekistan or Turkey. They were making sort of preparations, and so I always felt from November 2020 it was just a matter of time. Clearly, the book's release was timed for the 20th anniversary, and it was quite a tight sort of deadline. And then along the way, President Biden announced the 20th anniversary of 9/11 as the withdrawal date, and I was like, wow. I mean, politically, I thought that was a strange thing to do, and they subsequently modified that and brought it forward to August the 31st. But it was, I mean, I published a book, Dead Men Risen was published when nobody had any interest in Afghanistan at all, which, I mean, it was a little bit of a problem because all of a sudden, all the people that were COVID experts were Afghanistan experts, but even though they weren't doctors and some of them had never been to Afghanistan. So there was this sort of tsunami of news. but I'd written a preface, which in late August, obviously the book had gone to print. It was published September 7th. I went back to the preface and I read it with a little bit of trepidation, but I thought, you know what, this holds up pretty well. And in fact, I sort of adapted a little bit for excerpts. So the nightmare for an author, or one of the nightmares, is something really big happens that affects the story between going to print and publication, and that wasn't the case. And so I was speaking to all the Team Alpha people and other people in real time as this catastrophe unfolded in Afghanistan, and they had a lot of feelings about it. I mean, they sort of reconnected a little bit, I think in part because of the research for the book, because I was talking to each of them and sort of so they were comparing notes, I guess, about me and about what happened and stuff, and so they were sort of back in contact. And several of them started work and are still actually working very, very hard on getting Afghan allies out. So yeah, I mean, it did give it a poignancy and an immediacy, and I think there was a lot of very ill-informed commentary, and sort of still is. And sometimes I watch news reports and think, does this reporter even know that about 9/11, and that was the reason why we went in? And certainly a lot of people had no idea that the Northern Alliance, this is what the story is about, the Northern Alliance with CIA and Green Beret help and awesome might of US air power in the skies, but hundreds of Americans, not 100,000 as we got a decade or so later, managed to topple the Taliban regime in a matter of weeks, almost as quickly as the Afghan government collapsed in 2021. And so it was an astonishing success, because there was lots of talk of they were going to be bogged down for the winter, and it was going to be another Vietnam. And well, in some ways it did turn out to be another Vietnam, but that was that happened subsequently. And I think in a way there was sort of like a template or a set of principles of a light footprint of working with the indigenous resistance as advisors, not invaders. The invaders were the Arabs of al-Qa'ida. And there was a sort of a formula for success there that was jettisoned very quickly. And so I think, with the unraveling, it was a very sort of important exercise to go back to the beginning and see what this was all about. And I'm sensing what's happening now in terms of response to the book and interest is that the news at the time was too much for people to sort of comprehend or sort of fully kind of come to terms with. But there's a sort of a yearning now to sort of now go deeper, because I think there are a lot of people who really hadn't thought very much about Afghanistan for many years who now want to know.
I think there's that Google chart of keywords out there, and there's a noticeable spike in August, whereas it's been very low level for the previous several years. You touched upon something I did want to explore about that sort of interoperability aspect and how the beginning of the war was a model. I mean, you wrote in the Wall Street Journal that we won Afghanistan at the outset, but it turned into a self-defeating invasion. And I'm curious if you can talk a bit about the Wall Street Journal piece, but that key component about the interoperability, where it was frankly almost revolutionary in terms of the way that we approached Afghanistan. The Department of Defense was caught on the back foot. The CIA stepped up and said, "Hey, we never say we don't do Windows. We'll figure it out." And I think you captured that incredibly well. I'm curious if you can explore that, because it also brings in one of the questions we have from one of the audience, which is himself a former Dutch intelligence officer. Is how the foreign counterparts interacted at that early days with the Team Alpha, if they did on the ground. So there's a couple things in there.
Sure. Yeah. No, that was fascinating. So yes, the Pentagon didn't have a plan. You think they have a plan for everything up to and including invading Canada, but there was astonishingly no Afghanistan plan. Much to the extreme annoyance of Donald Rumsfeld, who I think gave General Tommy Franks a really hard time about it. The CIA did have a plan, which was sort of outlined in a thing called the Blue Sky Memo at the end of 2000, which was really based on the CIA sort of liaison teams going into the Panjshir Valley to link up with Ahmed Shah Massoud, who of course was the Tajik Northern Alliance leader who was assassinated by al-Qa'ida on September the 9th. But those teams have been going in and out of the Panjshir for more than 2 years before 9/11. And in fact, David Tyson was one of the people who would go in and out on those teams. And so, I mean, it's funny because I think actually David said to me the other day, you know, to describe that as a plan is sort of over-egging it a little bit, but it was certainly, it was the sort of contours of an approach, which was, you know, CIA teams part made up of paramilitaries, but also case officers and you know, medic and Green Beret, which is what happened with Team Alpha, the eight men, sort of being pathfinders for the Green Beret ODAs, the, you know, 12-man teams, you know, working with the Afghan allies. Now, in a way, this was new, but in a way, it was sort of going back to the beginnings. It was like the OSS in World War II, which was the sort of the forerunner of the CIA, but also of special forces. And I mean, even going back further to the Special Operations Executive, SOE, which was, you know, sort of an early model for OSS, where you have very small number, like the Jedburgh teams, you know, small number of the OSS, of small numbers of Americans, sometimes 3, and Team Alpha would split up. Often J.R. Seeger and Alex Hernandez would be at the sort of co-located with the ODA, and there'd be 2-3-man teams from Team Alpha going off, you know, deep behind enemy lines, you know, incredible risk every day, riding on horseback, you know, sleeping rough. And so it's sort of going back to those beginnings. But you know, in the 21st century, it was also very complex because you were you were aligning the sort of, I mean, Abdul Rashid Dostum's men were cavalrymen, and they fought on horseback, almost the only sort of people in the world that still did that. But the ODA, because they focused principally on the tactical side of things, where Team Alpha and the CIA focused more on sort of al-Qa'ida and the politics of sort of managing the tribes. You know, the ODA had to coordinate 21st century American air power with sort of, you know, 19th century fighting on horseback, which was extremely complex. And so, I mean, one of the things that sort of subsequently changed, where everything became sort of very sort of top heavy, and it was, you know, again, it was sort of a feature of Vietnam, where, you know, bombing targets being decided in the White House and all that kind of stuff. You didn't have any of that at the end of 2001. It was an incredible delegation of power to the lower echelons. So, you know, J.R. Seeger was making sort of, you know, tactical decisions, but they had strategic consequences. And he was talking to Hank Crumpton, who, you know, one level below Kofor Black in the Counterterrorism Center. Hank was running the war day to day. He was the person that, you know, Team Alpha and the other agency teams were talking to. I mean, he essentially was saying, well, you know, if that's what you think, JR, do it, you know. And that was generally speaking his approach. Occasionally there would be a sort of a, you know, conflict of interest or sort of analysis from 2 CIA teams where Hank would make the call, but generally speaking, it was decided down on the ground. And yeah, I mean, coalition elements, not too many of them, but, you know, Tony Blair was, you know, as we know from Iraq to his sort of political, you know, downfall in a way, was, you know, shoulder to shoulder with the Americans. You know, we had the band of the Coldstream Guards played Star Spangled Banner outside Buckingham Palace, you know, on 9/11. So Richard Dearlove, the MI6 chief, flew. To this day, people don't know quite how he did it because airspace had been closed down, but he flew to the US and was at CIA headquarters, you know, within a day of the 9/11 attacks. So the Brits sort of wanted it in. And so, I mean, it was very chaotic. So much of this was improvised. and just sort of worked out, not even on the back of an envelope, just sort of, I guess on the hoof will be a way of putting it, given that they were on sort of horseback so often. But there was a special boat service team, SBS, so UK's Tier 1 Special Forces, the equivalent of the SEALs. The SBS, they say they were the equivalent of SEAL Team 6, actually. But a bunch of them flew into Mazar-e-Sharif. The Northern Alliance didn't know anything about it. Task Force Dagger, commanded by Colonel Mulholland, who was the 5th Special Forces Group commander, he knew about it just before they landed. So it was. But the Brits wanted to get people in. Some of the Afghans still remembered some of the things that happened in the 19th century and weren't really keen on the British arriving unannounced. And so there ended up being 8 SBS troopers who were in Mazar-e-Sharif on November the 24th, 2001, which was the day before the prison uprising. And in fact, it's interesting that Tony Blair had been briefed. I mean, in some ways, you could argue Tony Blair wanted his cake and also wanted to eat it. He wanted the troops there, but he didn't want them being involved in any sort of nasty stuff. And he had, some of his briefing was that, Kunduz, which was the last stand of the Taliban in the north, looked like it was going to be a bloodbath and a lot of killing. And Blair was sort of nervous about the political consequences of British troops being involved in that. So the rules of engagement, or the national caveat, was that they couldn't take part in offensive action. They could only fire, when fired upon, which somewhat ludicrous in the environment, and the SBS certainly weren't very happy. But that meant they didn't go to Kunduz, and their Land Rovers were literally painted white, so they looked like sort of peacekeepers. So they were in Mazar-e-Sharif, being a bit upset they weren't part of the big fight with these white, ridiculous sort of white Land Rovers, but thankfully also general purpose machine guns. And they were there when, things went pear-shaped on November the 25th, and they were, a crucial factor in that prison uprising, which could have led to the recapture of Mazar-e-Sharif by Taliban and al-Qa'ida in that uprising failing.
I want to follow through on that and bring in sort of your outstanding book, which won the Orwell Prize, Dead Men Risen. I highly recommend everybody go out and pick that book up. It should be in paperback now, in addition to First Casualty. And rightfully so winning the Orwell Prize because of how frank and honest and candid that book was. And something that, which you just mentioned about the SBS teams being there in 2001 and Great Britain being shoulder to shoulder with the United States since the immediate aftermath of 9/11, which is something that I think unfortunately has been lost and forgotten in this country, significantly so. And I want to look, spinning the lens a little bit and looking at the impact that the British involvement in Afghanistan has had on sort of the British Army in particular, and the British defense culture more broadly, because the United States, we're grappling with the aftermath of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, trying to figure out what lessons are learned from it and adapt for strategic competition. But I'm curious what the legacy is in Great Britain of Afghanistan and the involvement there, and putting a rock to the side, because I think that's kind of a more complicated component there, but they are inherently intertwined.
Yeah, not a happy one. So Dead Men Risen came about because a friend of mine who I got to know in Northern Ireland, Rupert Thorneloe, who's a Welsh Guards officer, was killed in action July the 1st, 2009. And he was the commanding officer of the Welsh Guards, a battalion commander, lieutenant colonel. And he was the first battalion commander to be killed in action since H. Jones, who was the parachute regiment battalion commander in the Falklands War in 1982. And the Welsh Guards had already lost a company commander and a platoon commander. And it was the first time a battalion had lost those sort of three key leaders in the same battalion since the Korean War. So it was a really big deal. And there was an Operation Panther's Claw that summer, and it was sort of the height of the British involvement, around 10,000 troops, almost all of them in Helmand province. And it was the height of the British casualties. And, there's this town called Wootton Bassett that subsequently was renamed by the Queen as Royal Wootton Bassett, where it was close to the airbase where the bodies will be brought home, and a little bit like the sort of the iconic significance of Dover, Delaware, coming home to Dover. And so these caskets would land, and they would be driven, in a hearse, hearses through Wootton and Bassett, and people would salute, and the children of the dead sometimes will be, lining the streets. And it was just, it was heartbreaking and extremely sort of emotional, and it took a sort of a big toll. It's a much smaller country than the United States, and so the ability to sort of withstand casualties, is sort of more limited. And I think there was a sense that, although it was seen as, and to some extent still is, as a just war because of 9/11, and the UK has had its own problems with Islamist terrorism subsequently, but it was still sort of seen as an American war, one step removed. And I think Iraq, which was psychologically very closely connected, and that was definitely seen as an American war. And politically, Tony Blair, he never recovered from that, and there was a sense of people dying needlessly. And eventually, I think the two got bracketed together in the sort of terms of public perception, and there was a sense that the army, in particular, but UK armed forces, with this sort of that all militaries have, the sort of can do, we'll do more with less, rather than saying, actually, we're going to have to modify the mission here unless you're going to give us more troops and more equipment, which tragically was one of the things Rupert Thornlow at the sort of tactical level had done. He said, I can't, what you want me to do in Operation Panther's Claw, I can't do it with the troops you've given me. And so the plan was sort of modified. But there's a sense, I think with some justification in the UK, that the generals were sort of saying yes to the politicians, and there was no sort of clear plan. There weren't enough troops, the equipment. Some of the vehicles. Rupert Thornlow was killed in a sort of amphibious tracked vehicle that was sort of ripped apart by an IED. It had no armor underneath it in the rear, and he was just torn to pieces. And so there's been a strain of criticism, which I think has some justification, which was that this was sort of very good for the army. It was very good for the generals. A lot of people, every brigade commander in Helmand came out with a DSO, Distinguished Service Order, for big medal for leadership in combat, or a CBE, another big medal, and there was, there were a lot of brigadiers who went through Helmand, 6-month tours. And so, just as with the American public, a real kind of sense of distress at what happened at the end, and to the Afghans, and leaving so many behind. I actually had an English barrister who I sort of knew through other people actually connected to the Welsh Guards and Dead Men Risen, and that 2009 tour, who contacted me last night, asking me if I knew people who could provide money for British organizations to get Afghans out. So very much the same thing that I'm talking to Team Alpha members and Shannon Span and people about here. So I think it's caused and will continue to cause, I think, the UK to be very, very wary of foreign adventures, and to sort of turn in on itself a little bit. I can't see a major UK military operation in support of US forces happening in the next decade or so. And of course, we've seen a lot of defense cuts as well. So, this has all had probably an even more profound effect on the UK and the UK armed forces than has happened here. And, and there's quite a reckoning happening here as well, I think.
I want to pull the narrative thread from Bandit Country to Dead Men Risen to First Casualty, because each in their own way deals with an insurgent movement of sorts, be it the IRA in Northern Ireland, the Taliban in southern Afghanistan and Dead Men Risen, and then obviously Taliban and al-Qa'ida in First Casualty. I'm curious, given your extensive reporting and on-the-ground coverage, kind of what parallels do you see between the challenges that these movements have faced and how the respective militaries have adapted to these situations? I mean, we saw with First Casualty, the CIA had a model going back to the SOE and OSS, but very much made the developments up on the fly. Afghanistan and Great Britain, as you rightly said, found itself in a fight that it wasn't necessarily prepared for, and then Bandit Country going all the way back, the British military making up tactics and trying to separate the Catholics and the Protestants. I'm curious kind of what the threads you can pull together from across those three.
Yeah, well, sort of in terms of my approach, it's funny, somebody used the phrase, which I liked, your body of work, the other day, and I was thinking, wow, that sounds impressive. I've never thought of it that way. But there are connections between those three books. It's not like I wrote something about, I don't know, globalization and then a true crime book and then a war book. I mean, the dark underbelly of war and the sort of gritty reality of what happens and placing that in the sort of broader context. I guess that's a sort of facet of all three books. I mean, one of the things that used to sort of really infuriate American generals and senior CIA officers would be the Brits lecturing the Americans on their experience in Northern Ireland and even Malaya and the colonies and I think that sort of frustration from the American side was somewhat justified, because I mean, if you look at Northern Ireland, which was an incredible story for me to cover, because I was starting out as a journalist in the mid to late 90s, and it was a domestic story. It became, for a while when I was there, the biggest story in the world. But it was sort of a training ground for foreign correspondents as well, and in some ways it was treated like a foreign story, and in some ways it felt like a foreign country, although obviously the Unionists, the Protestants in Northern Ireland, never liked to hear people say stuff like that. But as soon as I got involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, it made me think how simple Northern Ireland was. I mean, a very small number of insurgents, terrorists, resistance, freedom fighters, whatever you want to call them, but the IRA, who were, I wrote about this extensively in Bandit Country, really in that small area, about 6 families, often who were associated with the IRA in previous sort of iterations, so passed down from family to family, lots of sort of intermarriage, and also smuggling in the border area and resistance to authority. They spoke English. Sometimes they would speak Irish, but not very often. And a very small patch of land, which was, for me, was fantastic as a journalist, because if something went bang, I could be there usually within an hour. And so despite all those advantages and it being part of the United Kingdom, albeit with a border with the Irish Republic, which we know from Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iraq and Syria and Iran and Afghanistan and Iran, that the borders in insurgencies are a big problem. If you're trying to quell the insurgency, particularly if they're safe haven, and the IRA had to an extent a safe haven in the Irish Republic in certain periods. But generally speaking, despite all those advantages the British had, it's still, in the course of like 25 years, it was essentially a kind of stalemate. And so, the parallels between, the other thing is IRA guys, are much more similar to your average Englishman than, some guy who grew up in Saudi Arabia is to your average American, so that in terms of, infiltration, the number of informers or agents, the recruiting was, much easier than when you're dealing with jihadists, because all the usual financial motivations, family, all those type of things, much more sort of more leverage. And the other thing about the IRA is not only did they not want to die, they didn't want to get caught. And so the sort of the suicide bomber element, right from 9/11, I mean, the IRA never did a suicide operation. And so, part of me, it was sort of, I felt, that a degree of sort of humility is sort of deserved with Iraq and Afghanistan, that if the British couldn't sort out Northern Ireland in 25 years, what hope did we have? And funnily enough, this is a feeling I got right back, when I was speaking to Team Alpha members. So it goes right back to that period after 9/11. So David Tyson, fluent Uzbek speaker, Dari speaker, Russian speaker, lived for years in Central Asia, went native to the extent that he didn't own a pair of shoes at one point in Uzbekistan, an expert on Turkmen shrines, and even he, the sort of probably the single American who closest to this stuff, he had this sense very early on. He said it would take me, many lifetimes to sort of, he would talk about the Afghan onion and the layers of the Afghan onion. So it would take him lifetimes to understand these people fully and their sort of motivations. And so, there was a sense, in a way, it takes a lot. You need to know a lot sometimes to know how little you know. And I got that sense from Team Alpha that, that was part of the principle, one of the principles they operated on, that this is an Afghan fight, and it can lead to terrible problems. In a way, the events of November 25th, when Mike Spann was killed in the prison uprising, was because there'd been an Afghan deal between Mullah Fazl, the Taliban commander, and Dostum. And there was sort of a fake surrender, but kind of an Afghan surrender when people weren't searched. These are not, American or Western ways of doing things. And so you have to accept the risk and the downside of letting the indigenous sort of fighters do it. But, I guess coming right up to now, we have learned that, America can't go to these places and sort it out. We just can't do it.
I was fascinated by the way that you captured, in particular, that the discrepancy between sort of the American approach and understanding and the Afghan approach and understanding, particularly on that sort of searching of prisoners as potentially being dishonorable for them, which you're accepting them at their word that they're surrendering. You wrote recently in the New York Times that, excuse me, that the Taliban haven't changed at all, that the West must not mistake tactical flexibility for real change. And I'm curious, you wrote exceptionally well about the beginning of how these teams navigated those tribal complexities and achieved a really great success. We found ourselves in August having withdrawn and basically leaving a mess in our wake that was already happening and flowing forward. I'm curious if we can just sort of look forward and turn your lens to kind of looking at what do you see coming next? What is going to happen in sort of your view, and what can the West do, if anything, or should they do anything at this point?
It's pretty depressing, I have to say. I mean, if anything, in some ways the situation is worse than it was before 9/11, because the Taliban have won. And I think they've learned a lot in the intervening years. I mean, I think they've learned a lot about sort of Western and American psychology and weakness. I mean, Mullah Fazl, who I just mentioned, is the Deputy Minister of Defense for the Taliban, which was the same role that he held in before 9/11 and in the immediate aftermath. He spent 12 years at Guantanamo Bay. He's a clever guy. I think he's also, a cold-blooded killer. Was involved in essentially genocide of Hazaras in northern Afghanistan. So, you have the personnel, and actually in that New York Times piece, I sort of outlined, and it's pretty common knowledge now of how many of the guys from 20 years ago are back in government, and their connections with, tactics of suicide bombing and, and all the rest of it. So, and they're emboldened. And I think that they're, we saw it in a way, again, going back to the beginning, or if you think of 9/11 as a beginning, you go back to the defeating of the Soviets, and the Soviets leaving Afghanistan in '89, and then the West sort of turning their backs, and the CIA, even apart from a small sort of band of people, essentially, deciding not to focus on Afghanistan because it was, viewed as a Cold War conflict. But in the 1990s, you saw the rise of global jihad and al-Qa'ida, and they were emboldened by that victory against the Soviets, even though the Arab fighters had very little, relatively speaking, to do with it. And so I think we had an attack in Liverpool, a couple of days ago. I think we saw it with ISIS, lone wolves, self-radicalized jihadists, whatever you want to call them, they're attracted by success, and we saw it with ISIS. I think we're going to see it with jihadism more broadly, and we'll have to see how ISIS-K plays out. But there hasn't been an attack on the U.S. homeland in 20 years, but al-Qaeda's never, at the same time, al-Qaeda has never left. The Taliban's never broken its ties with al-Qaeda. There are tactical differences. The Taliban is, focuses internally, al-Qaeda externally. But, I think they've learned how to use Western technology and, WhatsApp and social media, and they've because they understand Western sensibilities, and because there's no desire from anywhere in the West, including the United States, to go back there. I think there's a sort of a desire to put Afghanistan in the rearview mirror. And so I think recognizing the regime, or, giving them money, which will only sort of solidify, their rule, I think we're likely to see some of that. And for the Afghan people, I'm sort of, my phone is, it's on mute at the moment, but, it's pinging all the time with messages from Afghans. I managed, with the help of other people, to help get my translator, who I was working with a year ago, out, and he's currently at Fort Dix. He's here, but he's, almost miraculously lucky. There's so many people who are stuck there. I think Taliban don't know how to rule. They've been an insurgent group for the last 20 years. And I think, they're like, the proverbial dog that's always chasing the car and then catches the car. And what do I do now? So, I can't predict what's going to happen. But, there's clearly, I think there will be some kind of opposition or resistance, in due course in Afghanistan. I think it's sort of inevitable. But I see no political will in the US or elsewhere to support that. So, I think we're in for some very, very dark times.
It's interesting that you mentioned the Taliban not knowing how to govern, the state of Afghanistan, the nation state of Afghanistan. The New York Times and Wall Street Journal had articles where they had the low-level Taliban complaining about doing traffic stops and having to patrol the streets, and saying that they just didn't understand, and this was, for want of a better phrase, not fun, or what they joined up the Taliban for.
Right.
We've got time for one more question before I turn it over to Glenn to sort of wrap up. And given the thoroughness of this book, and it is genuinely impressive of how much detail you're able to put in there and how human the stories you convey are in there, is there something you wish you could have added now, or somebody to whom you wish you could have gained access that you couldn't for this book? And just sort of, that one missing piece there, just like, if I had that, I would, be satisfied.
Yeah. Well, to an extent, you're always striving for perfection, knowing that you're never going to reach it. And you're always, you'll never be satisfied. And certainly I could have spent, but I also work to a deadline as a journalist by sort of instinctively, like there comes a point where you have to sort of press the button. And you have to, and I could have gone on for another 5 years, certainly. I would love to have spoken to John Walker Lind, who, joined al-Qaeda and met bin Laden and was at the Al Farouk camp and stayed silent while Mike Spann was imploring him to speak, and Mike Spann recognizing that he was a Westerner, he thought he was Irish, or might have been Irish, because that was actually a cover story. I mean, Lynn did have Irish relatives, an Irish grandmother, and he'd been told by al-Qaeda to tell even fellow Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters that he was Irish. I would love to have spoken to John Walker Lind, and maybe I will one day. But the signs are that he's now, or certainly in recent years, has been an ISIS supporter. And so whether you'd ever get the truth from him, and he wrote a very sort of propagandist article for The Intercept, which was published on 9/11. So whether you'd get the true story from him, even of his own experience, I somewhat doubt. But yeah, that was an interview I would have, and I tried. That's an interview I would have liked to have been able to achieve.
Well, I can't thank you enough for joining us. I mean, the book is First Casualty. Of course, my camera's not zooming in on it, which is unfortunate.
Oh, it's all blurry. You can see it behind me, I think.
Yes. So thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Harnden, and I'm going to turn it over to Glenn for some final remarks.
Well, let me parallel Joshua's thanks, Toby, for engaging in this conversation with us today. Thank you, Joshua, for very capably managing what was a really interesting and in-depth conversation about a topic which is vital. Toby, thanks for the body of work in addition to this book, what you've done leading up to it. It is quite an important contribution, particularly given how much time you've spent in the field and how much insight you've imparted through that work, that will help people like us who want to understand policymaking side of things really have a very vivid picture of what it means to do this kind of work. That's absolutely vital to consider when we approach these questions. I want to say thank you to the audience that was with us today. I'm not going to name the folks that are watching, but let's just suffice it to say there are folks with very significant experience and leadership in intelligence work. And I just want to say to everyone, thank you. We understand that work often goes unsung and uncredited and is often very dangerous. And we appreciate the effort that folks make on the behalf of all of our security. So thanks to everyone who participates in those missions. And Toby, again, appreciate your sharing your thoughts and insights and helping us unpack and understand this in this vital area.
Sure, happy to do it. And thank you very much.
Hope we'll see you again. Thanks everybody for joining us today. We'll talk with you soon. Be safe, be well. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye. Thank you.